Are we sovereign individuals with rights of liberty and the pursuit of happiness by our divine creator, or are we livestock to be managed in this central technocratic control grid? So let's turn to our final presentation with the wonderful Daniel Brody, and for that I will ask my producer Logan House to introduce Daniel.
Thank you. Daniel Brody is professor of rhetoric and applied linguistics in the Graduate School of Intercultural Communication at Okinawa Christian University and a former imagery analyst with the U.S. Army. He will be presenting on the convergence of data and flesh, the financialization of and transformation of the human herd. And here it is.
Greetings from Japan. The
Financialization.
title of my talk is The Convergence of Data and Flesh, the Financialization and Transformation of the Human quote-unquote herd. In September 2005, during John Roberts' confirmation hearing to the Supreme Court, Senator Joe Biden offered to Roberts an interesting glimpse of the future when a judge, quote, will be faced with consequential decisions in the 21st century, unquote. Namely, can a microscopic tag be implanted in a person's body to track his every movement? Biden carries on, his tone emotive and marked with urgency. There is actual discussion about that. You will rule on that, mark my words, before your tenure is over. Can brain scans be used to determine whether a person is inclined toward criminality or violent behavior? You will rule on that, unquote. Of course, it does help when you're in a position of power to make predictions like these and enforce the official definitions of key words and concepts, such as weapons of mass destruction. Now, for those not blinded at that time by stories of mayhem and carnage coming out of Fallujah in Iraq, Judge Roberts' confirmation hearing seemed to illustrate how elites simply assume as self-evident that the technologies, policies, and executive orders they concoct and push onto populations are necessarily ethical and acceptable. With the public already primed through various media to see itself as a massive livestock, occasionally subject to programs of control, tracking, experimentation, and/or culling, Biden's predictions must have seemed somewhat troubling. In this talk, I'd like to discuss the historical roots of a form of technocracy, partly hidden from the conscious awareness of many, that shape contemporary concepts of human beings as beasts of burden whose numbers must be periodically reduced while being surveilled and controlled by their self-appointed owners. The march into a post-human world of captivity, as my colleagues have suggested, requires certain, quote, upgrades to biology that reduce human sovereignty over natural bodily functions, autonomy, and agency. The theoretical framework for my talk is Walter Lippmann's early 20th century analysis of the mass public. This sentiment is grounded in a larger social context and history of eugenics, whose signs of control over societies and social practices, such as reproduction, can be observed in the present age. Thought leaders during that era included Harvard's own president emeritus, for example, who, quote, warned against mixing the races, a central tenet of eugenics, unquote. Charles William Eliot urged that quote, each nation must keep its stock pure, unquote. Notwithstanding the connotations associated with stock as reminiscent of farm animals, Eliot was a proponent of forced sterilization of people declared to be, quote, feeble-minded, physically disabled, or, quote, criminalistic, or otherwise flawed. So we might be able to see more clearly from Senator Biden's interrogation of Judge Roberts in 2005 that the technological means of dominating the quote-unquote undesirables had already become realized since its inception in the early 20th century. Today, various signs of the technocratic tools of power and control over the so-called human herd might be recognized in the new, quote, cryptocurrency system using body activity data, unquote, which appears to point to a possible convergence of several of the transhumanist strands already discussed: micro and nanoelectronics, electrical engineering, networking, device connectivity, the, quote, health industry, and the lifestyle industry. It may also be worth noting that the year in which this patent was filed, March of 2020, the time when Earth's inhabitants were alerted to both a pandemic and an emerging bio-nano age that would, according to NASA's Dennis Bushnell, usher in new forms of warfare. What follows here is analysis of the signs of both the material and circumstantial evidence of transhuman capture, where humans now appear to be heading, and how the global project we are being surreptitiously integrated into intersects with the COVID era. In his January 2024 address at the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab offered an interesting insight about the powers that he and his colleagues have evidently arrogated to themselves. As trustees of the future, we are responsible for advancing a world which is richer in possibilities, more equitable in opportunities, and more secure in its foundations. Moreover, as leaders in governments, business, and society, we bear a particular responsibility to rebuild trust in how we assume our role as trustees, unquote. The language seems kind of reminiscent of corporate intrigue and superhero fantasy, a bizarre mashup of the Wolf of Wall Street, maybe, and the Guardians of the Galaxy. Nor can the contemporary transhuman turn into a post-human future be scarcely understood by the popular buzzwords, slogans, and vacuous platitudes peculiar to the reorganization of biological, financial, and social systems. Besieged by assaults coming from the corporate media and from political and pharmaceutical strongholds, the human body and biosphere appear to be entering a high-tech corral into total captivity. Now, assaults on the biosphere are as much a war on the people as they are on the enemy, striving to survive the battlefield. And because they're unleashed on populations in the marketplace and the social world, some of the main weapons in this war for technocracy are not so easily identifiable. Their lethality due in large measure to the official forms of rhetorical camouflage and bureaucratic cover they enjoy today. Dazzling the eyes of the public, the weapons are often camouflaged in ads, marketing false promises that life will be easier when inefficiency, sweat, and toil are reduced to zero. Such are the empty promises of yesterday's fully computerized world, claimed to alleviate unnecessary suffering and waste, but repurposed in the present for the bio-nano age. As an inculcated value, our continuing quest for ever-increasing speed and efficiency has inspired technologists to design tools that we, as the, quote, obedient herd, are urged to embrace definitions of ultimate meaning and purpose already provided for us, measured by the time we waste and trivial pursuits of temporal riches. Various scholars in the 20th century have offered useful interpretations of what they foresaw unfolding in the future, but which have remained partly hidden from the view of the masses, focused mostly on making ends meet. It is no surprise that human concern for social and economic power has motivated obsessive women and men for millennia to build systems of control over what they perceive to be unruly herds. This age-old effort to acquire higher levels of control saw significant fulfillment with the emergence of mechanical forms of timekeeping. As the, quote, key machine of the machine age, unquote, the clock, for example, with the addition of its minute and second hand, in the view of George Woodcock, gave the owners of the means of production the power to extract more time from their workers down to the very second. Key to squeezing tangible forms of value out of people prodded into pens of high military-industrial productivity is first conditioning them to perceive that their intrinsic worth is rooted in their own sacrifice to today's system of largely pointless, conspicuous buying and selling. This new form of sacrifice resembles serfdom more and more, cloaked in quote-unquote social equity, imposed through increasing technocratic measures of societal disruption, economic instability, and austerity. Understanding the present age more deeply can be aided by a return to the past century, when the tools and techniques to propagandize the masses were being formed from research on the human psyche and applied for practical purposes to a new industry known today as public relations, public affairs, community relations, strategic communications, etc. Edward Bernays observed in Propaganda that the, quote, steam engine, the multiple press, and the public school, that trio of the Industrial Revolution, have taken power away from kings and given it to the people, unquote. The rabble came to amass some of the power the king ceded to technological advancements. Since economic power is a magnet for political aspiration, the history of the Industrial Revolution reveals how that form of power passed from the king and the aristocracy to the bourgeoisie. Quote, universal suffrage and universal schooling reinforced this tendency, notes Bernays, and at last even the bourgeoisie stood in fear of the common people, for the masses promised to become king, unquote. What the aristocratic classes yielded over the past 250 years, however, they have since regained in a massive way in the guise of a global technocracy. A vast network of transnational financiers and corporate giants, quote-unquote, as Peter Phillips describes, have managed increasingly over decades to distill and return power to the hands of the few. Such are the power elites, known to C. Wright Mills in the 1950s, who function nowadays as a, quote, non-governmental network of similarly educated wealthy people with common interests in managing, facilitating, and protecting concentrated global wealth and ensuring the continued growth of capital, unquote. The giants have achieved what has been described by Citigroup analysts as a quote-unquote plutonomy. In a shareholder's prospectus leaked to the public, A.J. Kapoor et al. Explain in a subsection titled, quote, "Welcome to the Plutonomy Machine," unquote, how the United States, United Kingdom, and Canada are plutonomies, governed by a, quote, "managerial, technocratic aristocracy," unquote. They discuss the prime movers of the plutonomy and offer instructive ways of increasing investment, consolidating power, and concentrating material wealth, quote, exploited best, of course, by the rich and educated. Allied with governments, the giants of this present age work to weaken the democratic checks and balances of nations with, quote, disruptive technology-driven productivity gains, creative financial innovation, capitalist-friendly cooperative governments, an international dimension of immigrants and overseas conquests, invigorating wealth creation, the rule of law, and patenting inventions, unquote. Since the global rollout of the COVID-19 narrative, the pretenses of national sovereignty and democratic forms of government and due processes of law have been led inexorably to the gallows. All natural systems of reproduction, consumption, and digestion are now coming under the control and surveillance of the giants, as people yield their natural rights to land and all manner of material possession. It's hardly surprising that the figurehead of the World Economic Forum would respond with such delight when describing to David Gergen the material effects of dispossession on national sovereignty. Quote, "What we are very proud of now is the young generation, like Prime Minister Trudeau, the President of Argentina, that we can penetrate the cabinets. As participants in mass culture, we are presented with a veil of sophisticated PR in the schooling system and the public discourse to confirm our biases and tastes, numb minds, and efface our faculties of critical reasoning, directing our attention away from issues of public import. The technologies of mass communication expose consumers to the necessary illusions needed to elicit broad acceptance of new global systems of dispossession, while concealing the empirical world from public view. In this so-called new normal, I wonder what the herd does possess today beyond its nagging sense of desperation. In 2016, the World Economic Forum signaled an approaching time when official acts, royal decrees, and programs of dispossession would become so normal and routine that scarcely anyone might even take notice. In her article, quote, "Welcome to 2030, I own nothing, have no privacy, and life has never been better," unquote, Ida Alkin paints an image of a dystopian tomorrow when ownership of products is replaced by service. She frames the technocratic forms of serfdom in vague and glowing terms. Quote, "Welcome to our city. I don't own a car. I don't own a house. I don't own any appliances or any clothes," unquote. Have the technocracy been working overtime to further Bertrand Russell's characterization of the age since his lecture on, quote, "scientific technique and oligarchy," unquote, when he observed that in future such failures are not likely to occur where there's dictatorship. Diet, injections, and injunctions will combine from a very early age to produce the sort of character and the sort of beliefs that the authorities consider desirable. And any serious criticism of the powers that be will become psychologically impossible. Even if all are miserable, all will believe themselves happy, because the government will tell them that they are so," unquote. Even a cursory glance at society should apprise the casual observer, since at least December of 2019, that many people appear psychologically unable to recognize the various forms of controlled demolition unfolding before their eyes. Are they too comfortably numb and ill-equipped to criticize and act against the impositions of political power prevailing over the public discourse and insinuating themselves into every nook and cranny of social life? We also might wonder how humanity has arrived at this station, bound for 2030, where the COVID story has converged with the story of transhumans, robbed of their right to own anything but subject instead, against their consent, to all manner of mandated, data-driven, technological and pharmacological updates, implants and upgrades. If humans are resources, like all other exploitable and salable products, the perverse logic of the new normal frames human DNA as self-justifiably instrumentalized and financialized. Hence the necessity, as Klaus Schwab has pointed out, that humans must have biometric identities. Ultimately, the Great Reset will lead to a, quote, fusion of our physical, our digital, and our biological identities, unquote. Data, we are reminded in our digital culture, is fast becoming the new gold. Quote, the foundation of every technology and network communication is in fact data, unquote. Since the base value of the global economy is largely grounded in the exchange of fiat instruments, it's hardly surprising that these leading illusions are conjured up and sustained through this sort of wordplay offered by investment banks such as HSBC. Recall the bizarre claim that COVID-19 could contaminate and hide on hard currency, so it became necessary to replace the currency with digital IDs replete with chips to store and protect our money. Such absurdities, however, are still hardly known and scarcely comprehensible for the many who build their lives upon the false hope that money will save them. To buffer themselves from the social fallout of economic calamities, governments must concoct ways of, quote, mystifying policies and calling them something they are not, or concealing them, unquote. This engineered image of false value forms the public perception of the worth that currency takes. Such deceptions and half-truths must be increasingly devised and, over time, obscured by an ever-growing number of distractions meant to occupy public consciousness. This is why the World Economic Forum, for example, struggles to substantiate self-evident absurdities, to support the facade of this fourth industrial revolution that, quote, doesn't change what you are doing, but changes you, unquote. It isn't a lie, of course, that the giants are manipulating and modifying all manner of biological life forms, but it is a deception to claim as self-evident that citizens were fully informed and freely consented to the experiment they find themselves in. The so-called pandemic has merely served the needs of the long-planned convergence of humans and machines. In recent years, Schwab has clarified since then what he had meant in 2015 by, quote, genetic editing, unquote, by pointing out that the pandemic of 2019 represented a key moment in history when, quote, our physical, digital, and biological identities can merge, unquote. Who knew, besides aspiring cyborgs, that humans were born with digital identities? Schwab's declarations may sound suspiciously menacing, or too sci-fi, or too weird to be taken seriously, and yet they seem to reflect the prophecies of his countryman, Friedrich Nietzsche, who described the, quote, last man, happily absorbed in a hyper-rational life of servitude, an apathetic and cowardly supplicant of unquestioning conformity, seeking merely to subsist and amass the creature comforts, befitting the lives of people, vacant of any thought of their higher human purpose. For Nietzsche, the last humans are contemptible, unthinking, indifferent, amoral creatures who live lives of relative luxury and ease, absent of any sense of direction and incentive toward achieving excellence. It is why they strive just enough to maintain stasis, to sustain their safety and security with the obsequious sacrifice of their own human and civil rights. Compare Schwab to the experts in law, economics, finance, and sociology who, in the early 1970s, drew inferences about the dangers claimed to be inherent in computer-based record-keeping. In Data Banks in a Free Society, Alan Weston and Michael Baker concluded that previous predictions about national interlocking interests, erasing long-cherished privacy rights and due processes of law were unfounded, inaccurate, and uninformed, and that computerization, in and of itself, poses little, if any, threats to these rights. They base their conclusions on facts which, at the time of their study, appeared to square with their own lack of imagination of what scheming men in power might one day do with so much private data at the tips of their fingers. The surprising level of disinterest in contemplating the possibility that powerful computing machines might in the future be used by scheming people to assert total control over populations is remarkable. Other researchers of that period, however, have offered more nuanced predictions. Bertram Gross warned in Friendly Fascism, The New Face of Power in America, of a new form of social control, emerging in the corporate state nexus, which would come to gain power over social and economic life and lead society into an inevitable march toward technocratic slavery. He described the systematic seizures of power, first appearing in the United States, and then foresaw its spread around the world. It has since appeared across the earth in the guise of economic globalization and in the overseas projection of U.S. military power, and more recently in the lockstep obedience displayed by governments to the global plan of injecting populations with experimental pharmaceuticals, and the claimed effort to defeat a certain strain of the common cold. Taking care to stipulate that this ideology is not simply synonymous with neo-fascism, Gross noted how the purveyors of this unusual practice of fascism tended to view themselves as defending the country's authentic conventions in classical liberalism, which, in 1980, was in its neoliberal stage of development. Gross argued that this new form of fascism would give rise to the very forms of rulership we see today in the public-private partnership complex, where, quote, more concentrated, repressive, and militaristic control by a big business, big government partnership preserves the privileges of the ultra-rich, the corporate overseers, and the brass in the military and civilian order, unquote. This rebranded, quote, friendly strain of fascism would also lay the intellectual foundation upon which to justify the stripping away of those unpredictable features of the human being and to reconstruct the subject as a fully realized, hyper-rational, and efficient economic actor and capable of controlling his or her own destiny, of freely choosing paths not already prescribed by the state, and of questioning the immoral dictates of the ruling class. If we consider the contemporary world and the general inability among many to recognize this kind of domination in light of history, it is easy to see how people hardly noticed during the rise of Nazism, how and, quote, when the concept of massively organized information quietly emerged to become a means of social control, a weapon of war, and a roadmap for group destruction, unquote. But the recorded history of fascism provides today a pattern to recognize how symbolic tools as seemingly banal as data can easily be used for hideous ends. Of what significance to the emerging new order are data and the tools made to extract information from the body and sell it, The tools are at the center of a nascent system of slavery, its outlines slightly blurred by glossy PR, the messaging and imagery representing the planned integration of humans into all programs and policies of advancing technological progress. This is why the manufactured appeal of speed and efficiency for transactions has become a core value of modern life, and is once again leading the masses into technocratic captivity. Context and precedents appear at the gates of the machine. In his 2001 book, IBM and the Holocaust, the strategic alliance between Nazi Germany and America's most powerful corporation, Edwin Black describes the computer as the machine that came in time to retool the minds of men, our attitudes and habits, our perceptions and sense of self-worth. Without the device, he argues, the Nazis could not have carried out their plans of identifying the undesirables, expelling them from society, confiscating their assets, sending them to ghettos, deporting them, and, finally, undertaking efforts to exterminate them. As a primitive prototype of today's microprocessor, IBM's Hollerith machine enabled the Third Reich to catalog information on any person, process, or location through the mundane procedure of punching holes in columns and rows on paper cards, thereby reducing human beings to points of statistical data. Quote, "Not only can I count you as a member of the crowd," Black points out, "but I can individualize the information I have about you," unquote. Where you live, what your profession is, and where your bank accounts are. At that time, encoding paper cards with ethnographic data appeared in the material manifestation of numbers, tattooed on concentration camp prisoners. The marks served as chains binding captives to the fascist economy, as the Hollerith machines had been programmed to distill human essence into artificial, economic, political, and ethnic categories. For the giants who conceive of the masses today as an unruly herd, this dehumanizing program of capture and control is difficult to conceal, since conceptual categories are the result of perfectly natural thought processes. Latent contempt, stereotypes, and prejudices, which people in power and authority can certainly harbor, become manifested when these cognitive constructions are converted into spoken words, written policies, declarations, acts of repression, or programs of coerced medical experimentation. The problematic case for fascists in the 30s and 40s appeared as a moral dilemma that might be solved by a powerful PR system that would effectively categorize the undesirables and isolate them from the larger society for fear of contaminating the culture. The mechanical categorization and reduction of humans into data points was done, in part by turning tacit feelings into official actions of the state. In his service to the regime as propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels crafted the key narratives that positioned ethnic Jews and other undesirable elements into the non-human category, headed by the label of germs, vermin, and other sources of fear and loathing. Likewise, as state PR remolded public perception of the undesirables and deplorables through mainstream channels, the tabulating machines tagged captured peoples for servitude under the vigilant eyes and hands of authorities, machining the tools for the so-called final solution. Edwin Black isolated data points in the historical records, showing how IBM's Hollerith machine had revolutionized speed and efficiency in dealing with the tedious routines demanded by massive amounts of census data gathered under official programs of dispossession. Vast sets of numerical data could finally be managed in ways that made symbols into more meaningful impressions of human resources. The stultifying practice of accounting became fully integrated into the exciting new world of automated computation. If isolation and slavery began with the concentration camp inmate tattooed with an analog holorith number, will the new forms of slavery end humanity with concentration camp prisoners microchipped in the global matrix with a digital number? Save for a fundamental disruption in the present ongoing process, all signs of technological progress appear to point to this dehumanizing form of desolation. The tools and data needed for this matrix are virtually omnipresent and appear in most of the major nodes of mass communication, in smart devices, cameras, and sensors of the material world, augmented by the unfolding Internet of bio-nano things. This global confluence of data and flesh as sites of exploitation and financialization should be unsurprising to those who have, over the decades, taken note of the tools of big data applied to all products and commodities, both inorganic and organic. If IBM was at the leading edge of computing science in the 1930s, it is reasonable to see how its data innovations have since continued in the business of information machines. When Data Banks in a Free Society was published in 1972, the Universal Product Code was already being applied to items of trade. The IBM design of the UPC revolutionized tracking and control of all material goods at point of sale. Not long after its emergence, however, the ubiquitous barcode began appearing in tags for the management of livestock. Since a brand on an animal is prima facie proof of ownership, have the giants developed these marks for the bewildered herd? Signs of the blueprint to prod the herds into bureaucratic chutes for microchipping now appear in mainstream reports. The CEO of the Bank of International Settlements, Augustin Guillermo Carstens, expresses concern about the continued use of hard currency, since bankers can't know who's using cash, in what sums, for what purposes, and where. This sort of false urgency squares with the absurd COVID-era claim that cash is a dangerous vector for spreading pathogens. With digital data converted into an image of money, Carstens says the CBDC will enable the central banking system to acquire, quote, absolute control over rules and regulations that determine the use of that expression of liability, and we will have the technology to enforce that. And those two issues are extremely important, and that makes a huge difference to what cash is, unquote. In response to Carstens' surprising honesty, Richard Werner points out that despite BIS claims that CBDCs will be faster and more efficient than cash, European citizens do not trust the bankers. Citizens suspect that the effort to push CBDCs on populations is really about power, about monitoring, controlling, and restricting transactions, which is the unspoken, unequivocal attraction of the central planners. This is an extremely powerful technology because the giants can monitor through real-time market transactions the social, economic, political, and religious life of everyone. Werner stresses that the CBDC is not a currency, but rather a control mechanism, or a permit system as in the old Soviet Union, when you needed official approval for anything. A foolproof system of technocratic permission is key to gaining complete control over the bewildered herd. This is central to the Fourth Industrial Revolution. Travel beyond the boundaries of your 15-minute city? Criticize the system? Consume beyond your weekly quota of cockroach milk and cricket burgers? Honor the wrong object of worship? These quote-unquote offenses may see digital currencies suddenly switched off, social scores diminished, carbon footprints cut off, existence erased. Werner points out that the ultimate goal, what they really want, apparently, he was told by a central banker, is a CBDC, which looks like a small grain of rice that they want to put under your skin, which, in his view, is a violation of human dignity. So to get people to accept this, there will be a universal basic income, unquote. The crystallization of the cryptic appeal to merge the physical, digital, and biological identities of every human being has been forming for decades. As with all irrational calls for ever-increasing speed, efficiency, and productivity, the global financial system is central to any successful move into total depravity. If, as Werner suggests, a new crisis will likely precipitate widespread dependence on the bankers and the offering of their life's blood to the beleaguered masses, then the implantable CBDC represents the material substance of the new chains that will bind and guide the quote-unquote last man. Paradigm shifts in social, economic, political, or religious domains come as no surprise to careful observers who consider the key patterns appearing throughout history. In 1980, Bertram Gross predicted the convergence of mass consumption and the corporate capture of the masses with the emergence of new information technologies. Quote, "The collection of information is now possible through increasingly sophisticated systems," he observed, including the more ominous forms of remote electronic surveillance, unquote. With advances in processing speed and networked computing, he observed that, quote, "most disturbingly, the means of control over this great mass has been developed to such a degree that centralized systems can keep tabs on incredible amounts of information over long sequences of widely dispersed and decentralized activities," unquote. At this point in history, it may be hard to shake the subtle unease that all the tools needed to keep tabs on everyone and every transaction are already at the disposal of the giants to use against the so-called herd. During the early stages of the rollout of the COVID-19 narrative, for instance, Microsoft's patent application for a new cryptocurrency system using body activity data aroused attention for its apparent unsettling fulfillment from a somewhat cryptic passage appearing in the ancient book of Revelation. Quote, "And he causes both great and small, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark in his hand or in his forehead, and that no man may buy or sell save he that had the mark, or the name of the beast, or the number of his name," unquote. If data is indeed the new gold, it's only reasonable that it serves as an elemental piece of the financialization of everything, especially unpredictable human beings. With their identity fully merged with digital data, the last humans will become sufficiently stabilized and predictable, or compliant, so the CBDC will appear to serve as the mark of compliance, extracting all the necessary digital information needed to keep the new economy running and the lusts of its overlords satisfied. The applicants for patent 2020-06-06-06 described the new technology as a sensor that calculates the energy output of verified humans connected to the network, a kind of global central nervous system. Quote, "Human body activity associated with a task provided to a user may be used in a mining process of a cryptocurrency system. A server may provide a task to a device of a user, which is communicatively coupled to the server. A sensor communicatively coupled to or comprised in the device of the user may sense body activity of the user. Body activity data may be generated based on the sensed body activity of the user. The cryptocurrency system, communicatively coupled to the device of the user, may verify if the body activity data satisfies one or more conditions set by the cryptocurrency system, and award cryptocurrency to the user whose body activity data is verified." Unquote. With easy access to the mainstream corporate media they own, the giants who write the scripts and contrive the policies of the Fourth Industrial Revolution manage, quote, information in this data-driven world, recognized now as exciting, sexy, and consummately modern. And not for the first time, at least since print culture, the thrill of data has been linked to brave new technologies, unquote. Is the implantable chip described in the Microsoft patent that brave new tool whose use and acceptance are now being normalized in the media? Its speed, efficiency, and security casts as so exciting and vital that no one in the mainstream critically examines where these tools will take humankind. During World War II, Karl Polanyi appeared in The Great Transformation to foretell a time when citizens would surrender to the seemingly magical forces of the free market and imagine it as an autonomous power able to judge all that is best and just for society. Quote, "Such an institution," he wrote, "could not exist for any length of time without annihilating the human and natural substance of society. It would have physically destroyed man and transformed his surroundings into a wilderness." Unquote. Today, that institution is elemental to a global neoliberal plan, observes Wendy Brown, to, quote, "configure all aspects of existence in economic terms, and to render human beings as human capital," unquote. At this present stage in history, can humans freely consent to their own technocratic captivity? Can they have come so far to advance civilization over millennia, only to capitulate control over their natural privileges, forfeiting their preordained birthright to be fruitful, to multiply, to fill and subdue the earth, and have dominion over the fish and sea and birds? If the trap is set by the growing public perception that technocracy is somehow only a normal consequence of human progress, then stepping into this snare requires a great deal of clever messaging, as well as effective manipulation of emotions. Entire industries of transnational interests have arisen to exercise control over a colossal complex of non-governmental organizations in modifying, patenting, tagging, registering, tracking, and controlling the hidden wealth stored up in all biological agents and objects. The observable and microscopic, the animate and inanimate universe acquired, reconfigured, and tokenized for investment, development, and sale. The incremental top-down acquisition and degradation of rights has long been in the making. One way to see more clearly how submission to vampiric forms of governance are now tolerated is to observe how media mesmerize consumers to accept, without question, the mandates, injections, injunctions, and directions peculiar to, quote, "managed democracy," sanitized of genuine citizen participation, where governments are legitimated by elections they've learned to control. Alexis de Tocqueville's observations, I think, are still instructive. The democratic form of despotism does not destroy, but prevents things from being born. It does not tyrannize, it hinders, compromises, enervates, extinguishes, dazes, and finally reduces each nation to nothing more than a herd of timid and industrious animals, of which the government is the shepherd. One final question might be for us to ask: was Tocqueville a prophet or just a careful observer?
Daniel, thank you so much for that presentation. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that finishes our four excellent presentation. David Hughes, Patrick Wood, Lissa Johnson, and Daniel Brody. And now it's my pleasure to welcome all of them back, along with Logan, our producer, to a panel. We've had a great discussion in the live stream chats. I have a whole group of questions, but before I dive in, Patrick, any thoughts or things you want to say before we begin? I can't hear you, Patrick. Can you hear?
There we go. I can hear you now. Yeah,
There you go.
I could hear you.
Okay.
You didn't hear me, but all I can
Okay.
say is wow, just wow. We've set out to achieve an outcome. We've done it. And I think this is the first time that we see a comprehensive look of what's going on in the world, how people can make sense of it, where they can take it from here, why they need to be prepared, etc. It just wow. We've hit the ball out of the park.
Well, we're glad you're pleased. Okay, so let's dive in. First question. Um, One question, and you said, Patrick, that technocracy revolves around the use of energy. We all have studied, observed what's been happening for the last at least 100 years on breakthrough energy. We know a great deal of energy technology has been suppressed. How does breakthrough energy figure in